These were highly complex societies with deeply instituted communities, ways of life, languages, governments, and spiritualities. During these periods of forced occupation, continuing to the present day, many of our peoples have experienced a loss of land, culture, and identity, as well as forced displacement within the islands and across the diaspora, for reasons economic, political, and otherwise. We acknowledge our dual positionalities as peoples affected by colonialism and as continued perpetuators of violence against Indigenous peoples in the Philippines. It's important to remember that education happens on Indigenous land, and we are very excited to see these two scholars in conversation later today. Without further ado, I would like to turn it over to Dr. Ocampo for his presentation.
Hey everyone, my name is Dr. Anthony Ocampo. My pronouns are he, him, siya. In Tagalog, Filipino, we have gender neutral pronouns, so yay us. I just wanted to acknowledge the hard work of all the different sponsors here. It is always so much more fruitful when the events that are put on are done in a collaborative fashion, just like this. Because I feel like I wouldn't be there's no way I would be where I am today as a writer, as an academic, had it not been for the sponsorship and mentorship, primarily of Black and brown women of color who, you know, took a queer brown kid from LA under their wing and helped them become something. So I just wanted to say that out loud, acknowledge that I am on the stolen land of the Tongva people. So thank you for the land acknowledgement. Also want to acknowledge that I am from the colonized country, double colonized country of the Philippines. And so I appreciate that we are harnessing the ancestors, not just from the land we're on, but also the lands beyond and across the ocean. So I'm going to share my screen. I hope that's okay. And I know that for today, the way it's supposed to run is that we're gonna chat about my book for about 20 minutes. And then hopefully if the professor, if Dr. HoSang comes in, I would love to be in conversation with you, but please know that I'm more than happy to be in conversation with the audience. I'm very capable of keeping up with the chat. So if you feel like you want to chat some commentaries, questions, high fives, emojis, whatever the case may be, feel free to do so. I'm very, very happy to be interactive. Of course, if folks also want to unmute themselves, please feel free to do so. I'd love to have your questions during the talk as well. So I come at this topic, I had never thought I could write a book. Let me just say that out loud. The idea of writing a book, the idea of getting a PhD, the idea of becoming a professor, a writer, that people whose work people actually read was just not something that was ever in my purview for most of my life. So up until the ages of 0 to 18, like a lot of you, most of my academic curriculum in history class, social studies was centered around the experiences of white folks. And it was very like intermittently that we would ever hear about the experiences of people of color, that like Filipino, Latinx, Latina folk. And so it was a really odd thing when I got to college, and I started to have the opportunity to attend events like this or take full-on courses on the Filipino experience. And that stuff changed my life. I'm going to be very, very upfront. I went to an undergrad institution that in a lot of ways is structurally, racially, in terms of like prestige, similar to Yale University. I went to Stanford, and Resty just mentioned that there were like 30 Filipinos in the entire campus. Stanford was very similar at the time that I started there in the year 1999. And so I say this because when I was an undergrad, I wanted to drop out. I wanted to get the hell out of there and go to Berkeley, where there was like a thriving Filipino American community. And part of what allowed me to stay at Stanford was having the opportunity to take courses in Chicano literature, Chicana feminism, Latino studies, Latinx studies, Asian American, the Asian American novel, African American psychology, African American history from 1850 to the present, and then 1850 and before. In other words, I had a lot of opportunity to take courses where my experience as a person of color, my experience as a son of immigrants, my experience as a queer person, questioning person at the time, had value in an intellectual conversation. And so I say that because the work that you're doing today to shepherd an event like this is so important, because most of us grow up with little opportunity to study quote unquote our own. I mention all that because it was in those ethnic studies classes that I started to rebuild my academic confidence. I happened to live in a freshman dorm that was predominantly white and very wealthy. I was telling Bella earlier that I had a classmate down the hall who grew up in Park Avenue. Another classmate was best friends with Natalie Portman. Another classmate was complaining that her dad only gave her an Audi convertible for a Sweet 16. And so I was like a fish out of water. And in that type of environment, I felt like, as a Filipino that grew up in a household where I lived with cousins, and I lived with my cousins, my grandmas, and we ate like food with a spoon and fork, and we went to the Philippines on occasion. I felt like all those experiences, I didn't have the confidence to share those experiences. And it was only in my ethnic studies classes that I not only started to share those experiences, but was given the space to actually write college essays about what it meant to be Filipino, which at the time, there wasn't a whole lot that was written about the Filipino American experience. We had like Carlos Bulosan's book, America's in the Heart. But besides that, unlike today, there wasn't a whole lot of academic research in the publishing world. It was very like there were a few novels and memoirs. And so it was just really hard. But the moment that I met one of my history professors, Professor Don Mabalan, who sadly passed away a few years ago, that was the space where on the first day of class, she said, if you learn nothing else from my class, this is the only Filipino studies class I ever took in my life. She said, if you learn nothing else from this class, I want you to learn one thing. Go get your PhD and write about Filipino American experiences. We need more Filipinos in PhD programs. And so that's what I ended up doing. I ended up interrogating the question about, for those that are unfamiliar with the Filipino experience, I was like, there's a lot of us in this country. There's 4 million Filipinos. We're the second largest Asian American group. But oftentimes we're forgotten as Asian Americans. People don't necessarily think of the brown kid with the last name Rodriguez as like the quintessential Asian American. They're almost thinking about East Asians most of the time. And I want to just share a few moments from the book that really illustrate not just these moments when Filipinos felt a sense of disconnection from Asian Americans, but what I also discovered in the course of this research is that even if Filipinos aren't technically in the same racial box as Mexican Americans, Latinos, there was a lot of moments when I found that Filipinos related to them more. So in the book, I open with this question of like, what's the relationship of Filipino Americans to the larger Asian American identity? And I think about this story that I opened my book with. I was in my last year at doing my PhD at UCLA, and having spent 7 years in graduate school, I was not very, let's just say I was like totally broke at that point. And so I remember when I came across in the hallway this flyer that said, alcohol study. Do you drink alcohol regularly? Are you Asian American? And I thought, this is gonna be the easiest $200 I'll ever make in my life, right? And so I called up the study coordinator. I told them my info, but then the coordinator of the study said, I'm sorry, we can't have you be part of the study because Filipinos don't count as Asian American. And I was very upset, but I knew I wasn't the only one that felt that way. When I looked at like other research, what I found is that in the city that I grew up in, LA, if you ask people, what is your racial identity? They'll say like 95% of folks that are Chinese, Vietnamese, Korean will say Filipino. but only 45% of Filipinos did the same. And so for me, the question was always like, why is this the case? So in the book, I talk a lot about how race, it's more than just checking a box on the form. You got to think of it as it's made up of a constellation of factors beyond your skin color. It entails your behavior, your last names, your hair texture, and the meaning of race changes based on the context you are. But regardless, race is something that always matters. It's ever present. Um, and what ended up being the driving force of writing the book was that in the course, not only of my own experience growing up in LA, in a neighborhood that was predominantly Filipino and Latinx, and a school that was very much Filipino and Latinx, is that I very much witnessed every single day the cultural similarities between Filipinos and Mexican Americans in the case of LA. So in terms of our last names, like my last name's Ocampo. I have cousins with last names like Rodriguez and Torres. And those are names that you associate with Latino populations. I spent a lot of time I grew up in the Catholic Church. And so Filipinos and Mexican Americans were worshiping side by side. And so for me, it was really interesting to tell this story that, hey, for a very long time, in part because of the colonial history, there's a lot of Filipinos in LA who, and this is a quote from a respondent. This is not my phrasing. They said, Filipinos are like the Mexicans of Asia. And of course, this person, when she said this, she was joking. But if you unpack that statement, what she's trying to show is two things. Number one, that Filipinos on their own are not often seen as Asian, particularly in a site where they're surrounded by Latinx folks. And also, saying this catchphrase that was meant like as a quip or a little bit of a joke, the Mexicans of Asia, what she meant was that there is this unmistakable, unignorable connection between people of Philippine descent and people of Mexican descent. And throughout the book, I talk about how that legacy that is a product of Spanish colonialism is something that shapes the relationships of Filipinos and Latinos today. I deliberately include this image, which is it's a mural by a muralist named Eliseo Silva, and on the bottom you'll see a picture of Cesar Chavez, and as well as the Filipino farm workers that fought alongside him there. Itliang, Philip Veracruz, Dolores Huerta is in the back as well. And I think that I like sharing this image because it showcases that even though race is something that we use to categorize people, there are moments when those racial differences, because of things like colonialism or labor, can break down and eventually lead to different forms of identification. So I guess I'll close before we go to Q&A by saying that even though Filipinos are like a unique immigrant ethnic group, what I learned is that unpacking the experience of Filipinos was useful for not only learning about myself and my history, but it was actually super useful for learning about the way that race works in this country in ways that you can't necessarily see when you only look at like the experience of Black and white Americans. So I'll pause there. Hey, Professor.
Hey, Professor Ocampo. Thanks for that great presentation. And sorry to be joining a little late. How are you?
I'm good. It's still warm in LA. So
I'm jealous. I'm jealous. Well, and we also wish you were here with us, but like really grateful for your time. I have so many questions and, so enjoyed the book. And I just want to say to the folks, since we have this, hybrid mode, I think, Dean Yee, you're going to work on getting some questions there from folks at La Casa, and I'll invite folks who are on the Zoom to also share their questions. I have one in the queue. So many things I want to ask you about, and I just wanted to lift up, just that really elegant phrasing at the end, that to think about race as both a constellation, something that's shifting, and across the book you show all these markers like places race is made, and yet to also resist the idea that that means it's illusory, right? Like it doesn't have material, meaning. So I wonder if I'm just gonna like a couple of questions here, like how do you see that same lesson and insight playing out when you're teaching this to other students about the sociology of race? Because I think people might think, oh, well, this is just like a Filipino question, right? Because for other people, race is fixed, and you're doing the outliner case. But could you just talk about like how we might use that formulation of yours to think about race more broadly?
Yeah, I think there's some other specific examples of groups that sort of fit in the middle. I before I started on this research, I found myself in indulging in multiracial literature, in part because this idea of feeling tied between two worlds, two racial groups, was something that was super like the narrative resonated tremendously. Of course, we can think of groups like Indo-Caribbeans, who are like, you know, if you think about Indian descent folks that migrated to the Caribbean and formed families with Afro descent people, they're another example. But I think that the take home for me was that what surprised me about the Filipino case was that a lot of my second generation, that means US born, but parents are immigrant respondents, they would be so articulate when it came to talking about the history of colonialism, even if they themselves had never lived in the United States. I'm sorry, sorry, lived in the Philippines, which is the colonized society. And I think that there were two reasons for this. Number one, the proximity of growing up around Latinx folks meant that, wow, I'm hearing my dad use these words, and I'm hearing my Mexican friends' dads use these words. Like, why is it that they're the same, or why is it that our last names are the same? And so what ended up happening is that colonialism became part of the racial narrative in ways that I thought was in contrast to what we think about colonialism as like something of the past. Like, colonialism happened long time ago, yesterday. We don't even think about the implications of it. And so knowing that the residue of the past can come alive today, even in the absence of an actual colonial regime, it made me, and this is what I think is the beauty of Asian American studies, is that we really have to think about how these historical relationships between states, these unequal relationships between states, these like the uneven relationships that are inherent to colonialism or imperialism or war, those have long-lasting effects on the way children and grandchildren of those immigrants think of their place in the United States. I think it's no accident that people were starting to reference the Philippine American War whenever the Iraq invasion was happening, because in some ways the impetus was the same. The United States is trying to help, right? And then in the spirit of this like benevolence, violent benevolence, we want to like incorporate some of you in our society, and yet we're kind of letting you come in, but if you come in, we're treating you like shit, right? So like the narrative, like this tussle between like the United States forcing itself on other societies and then forcibly incorporating its descendants is something that I think goes beyond the Philippine story.
I mean, it's such a great reminder of, you know, that colonialism is not just like a formal arrangement, right? It has a whole, it's like a far more profound kind of sensibility than that. And I was thinking your story about Junot Diaz, right? When he said about, you know, from New Jersey to Manila, about the relationship even between like Marcos, the dictator in the Philippines, and Trujillo, and how that shapes a certain kind of sensibility. So just as the last question, and then we already have some questions queued up on Zoom, what about that and about the kind of like transnational dimension to, you know, many forms of Latinx experiences, identities, and Filipino identity, about being, you know, living in multiple places and across multiple times in some ways, as you're talking about. Could you just say a little more about that?
Yeah, I love that question. And I'm thinking about how sociology and the way it studies race is kind of ill-equipped to address that question, right? Because they're like, transnationalism, what do you mean by that? How do we measure that, right? And I think what the Junot Diaz quote really illuminates is that with race or racial connection or colonial connection, sometimes it's a feeling that can't be explained, right? And if it's a feeling that can't be explained, if we're talking about something that can't be quote unquote seen but felt, what do we do with that in our social movements, in our organizations, in higher education? Because those are all institutions that don't like that lack of precision, but we still need to address that lack, that very, very real feeling that you just can't necessarily put your finger on. I have a colleague, really close friend and colleague, Jonathan Rosa, who's Puerto Rican, and we have endless text conversations about like what it means to be a descendant of 1898 when the United States colonized Philippines and Puerto Rico. There's just a certain like essence that comes with that you can't really just crystallize in the form of like a little form or a checkbox or filling in a bubble. And he and I both struggle with like, how do we grapple with the fact that we feel all these things, and we feel it in different arenas. We both also happen to be queer. We feel it very differently in queer spaces. Like there's so much knowledge that needs to be unpacked from there, but academia or social science as of right now isn't really equipped to confront how to go about talking about those connections. And that's part of the reason why I find myself gravitating more to literature, like fiction. Like sometimes you can best tell truth through fiction. And I really do realize, like, I really believe that. Not just fiction that's like a story, but like speculative fiction, sometimes I think is the best way to achieve certain truths. So
yeah. Thanks. I mean, that point about 1898 is just so profound because that links, Puerto Rico and the Philippines, but also Hawaii and Guam, and even African Americans in the US fighting against Jim Crow, who were criticizing the US invasion of the Philippines, right? I mean, it crystallizes a sensibility about colonialism and racial domination.
Yeah, I would love to, if there was ever a 1898 symposium or conference, I would be like, put me on the organizing team, because I just want to exist in that space and see what comes up. So
yeah, so many connections. So we have already 3 questions Zoom. I don't know, Dean Yee, is it all right if I take some of these questions online first, and then we'll go back to the room? So if I could invite Miley Harris, I don't know who's hosting, who can unmute folks, but.
Yeah, hi, I'm Miley, and I wanted to follow up on some of what you touched on about the multiracial experience. For example, I am Thai, Spanish, Filipino, Irish, and English. And it's oftentimes very confusing for me to engage in these conversations about race and colonialism, because there are these tensions present in my own heritage. And so it often feels like, part of that heritage is being vilified, while part of that heritage is like the center of the conversation that's trying to be uplifted. So when we do have these dialogues, how do we address and include and speak to the experiences of other multiracial individuals like myself?
Yeah, what I think is what I appreciate about this discourse and this overall body of writing on multiracial experiences, that number one, I appreciate folks that talk about the need to go beyond thinking in like fractions. So like someone, if they're like grandparent is, let's say, Chinese, they'll be like, I'm a quarter Chinese, right? Or they'll do the fraction thing, when in fact, in reality, that person could have been raised in like Monterey Park in California, or like a Chinese American ethno-burb, and be like in their eyes like super Chinese, minus the fact that they're perceived to be different. So I think like what I credit folks in multiracial literature doing is that they help us remember that racial categories are social constructs, right? There is no like quintessential face that should be seen as like this ethnicity. And so I think sometimes we often get so bogged down in the idea that like, if you look a certain way, that means you're of this race. One thing that's kind of a peculiar silver lining of Philippine media is that the folks that get elevated in Philippine media look very different than the average Filipino on the street. And so, yes, on the one hand, they're like elevating Western aesthetics of what people look like, but the silver lining is that they're expanding the boundaries for what a Filipino could look like, right? It's everything has its good and its bad. And I think with what you're experiencing, there's just such a richness, because like for me, the question is, what were the social circumstances and the context that allowed me to exist? Like that's the question I would ask myself. And what is really, really unpacking the family story do to teach us something about the way this world works? I think that there's something really unique and advantageous that someone who's multiracial, particularly of like many different ethnicities, like just by virtue of tracing your family tree and learning the relationships of people, will learn about the different societies from which they're from and the relationships between those societies. That's pretty darn cool. And so I think of it from like I spent a lot of time being like, man, F academia, they don't give a shit about Filipinos, right? And I've since shifted to see my Filipino-ness as like the superpower that lets me see things so crystal clear when I just like lean into the Filipino-ness unapologetically. So that would be my tip, I guess, that would for you. But yeah.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Miley, for that great question. I'm going to turn Dean Yee to you in a second. I just really appreciate, I think that's such an important reminder about what are the insights that these experiences allow us to see. Sometimes the institutions treat us like, oh, your identity means, it just means trauma. It just means suffering. And like, you're right, you're kind of degraded. And you're saying like, well, that's not how I think about myself. Right. I think about myself as having capacities that this institution doesn't have. And just that your whole point about ancestry, that we're not talking 23andMe, we're talking about geopolitical questions of domination and resistance and war and possibility, right? That's what a genealogy is. It's not something that, you spit into a plate. So I'm going to turn to Caroline. Do you want to ask your question, or do you want me to ask it? Caroline Helson. See if we have Caroline.
Yeah, I can ask it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for this talk. This is fascinating. I didn't know people were actually saying these things out loud, so this is great. So what I was wondering is, what kind of response have you heard from Latinos descendant from South and Central America to the idea of Filipinos as the Latinos of Asia? Has it been like accepting or not accepting or somewhere in between?
Yeah, that's a great question. I have a dear friend named Lacey Abrego, and a Central American Studies scholar. We were in grad school together, and we sometimes used to commiserate. I'm Filipino, she's Salvadoreña, and how our ethnic groups were like the marginalized members of like the broader category. Like in LA, it's like, Asia, it's like East Asians, and then with Latino in LA, it's like it's a synonym for Mexican, right? And so in some ways, there's been this funny among certain colleagues that are Salvadoran, there's been this funny like camaraderie of being the ignored ethnicity in the broader like pan-ethnic category. With that said, I want to acknowledge that the pathway of Salvadorans here, other Central Americans to the United States, is very different from Filipinos. Filipinos, for the most part, are coming as like professionals, college educated, and Central American migrations are post, Civil War in El Salvador to like the arenas of work that they enter are very different than that of Filipinos, and so the labor position can mean that like Filipinos don't relate as much with some Salvadorans. So some of the connections I'm reiterating are more like second generation folks coming together, not the immigrant generation where the class divergence is too great. In terms of the response from folks from like non-Mexico, what I found is that it's regionally dependent. So in LA, there are a lot of places that are multi-ethnic, multiracial, in which case I've seen like Latinx folks from those ethnic groups say like, oh, I totally see it. Like we're like part of the same like cultural identity. We were all, they say all sorts of things about we were all effed by Spain. Like they'll say those sort of phrases out loud in like a casual context. But I do think it's important to acknowledge that like class plays a huge role in whether groups are able to come together or not. And so what I've seen among the immigrant class is when we have like Filipinos that are in, you know, low wage work, domestic work, coalescing with Latinx folks in domestic work and forming coalitions around there. So it really depends on the context.
And if I could just add a quick follow-up question.
Yeah, of course.
Do you have any goals for where you hope to see this work create change? One thing I think of is college admissions and like scholarships, for example. Like
Mhm.
I like, you know, it's hard sometimes to bubble in Asian because of this conversation, you know, knowing that it doesn't totally describe the full experience of what it means to be Filipino, and that impacts admissions and that impacts scholarships related to like, you know, who is in a more minority position, I guess. I don't really know how to phrase that right, but so that could change. Or are there other areas that you hope to see change?
Yeah, very, very practical question. I love it. One of the biggest things I remember, one thing that came a lot with the people I interviewed is like Filipinos applying to med school or Filipinos applying to law school or grad school, where they're being told, oh, you're well represented, you know, in these fields. And they are coming from the angle, let's take the student, for example. They're like the one Filipino that stuck it out in molecular biology, and all the other Asians didn't want to like invite her to their study group because she's not East Asian. And then she's being told that like, oh, there's a ton of Asians, like as if that like means her pathway was so easy, right? People get, I get really riled up when I look at organizations like the scholarship organizations or the NSF that just like are so damn ignorant about the diversity of experiences under the Asian umbrella. Because in my mind, I'm like, have you been to a Hmong American community or a Laotian American community? Have you like actually dived into the experience of what it means to be a Filipino in academia, like or in med school? No, you're just sort of using these lazy shorthands to ignore a major problem, and people are suffering because of it. So I feel you on that. Oh, can I answer that question another level? I also believe in writing the things that I should have been able to read. I think that's like a very Toni Morrison-esque sort of thing of like, write the book that you want to write or you wanted to read, or I'm butchering it. But one of the biggest things I never realized is that in writing this book, I kind of, this is going to sound crude, but I want my book to be like a first date to Filipino studies. And so knowing that like, that's the issue of representation. Like you get one chance to get people interested. And if you F it up, no, you'll be like, oh, I'm never reading anything Filipino again. Right. And so for me, I wanted to write something that would give people an entree into the world of amazing Filipino writing that's out there. So yeah, it's on a practical level, the change I want to make is like, I want more Filipinos to be in positions where they could define the narrative and tell the story.
Thank you.
Thanks for that great question, Caroline. And, you know, just for the students who haven't had a chance to pick up the book, I mean, I so appreciate, it's such an accessible style, right? Like, so you're using anecdotes, first person observations with, you know, a rigorous social science methodology. So you're really showing us that both are possible. I think we have Min next. So Min, can I invite you to share your question?
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much for this talk and conversation, Professor Ocampo. So I guess my question has to deal with methodology and like disciplinary formation. So I was just sort of struck by and like still thinking about your earlier reflections on the maybe like limitations of sociology, but also, as you said, like the social sciences in general, and being able to like comprehensively convey or think about race, gender, sexuality. And I was also sort of struck by your recounting of like your intellectual genealogy and your interest in multicultural literature and like speculative fiction. So I guess I was wondering if you could talk more about your relationship to interdisciplinarity and how you mobilize it, not only in like your research and methods for this book, but also in your like teaching practices as well.
Yeah. I'm an ethnic studies undergrad. I majored in ethnic studies, like super hardcore pro ethnic studies. And in that world, we studied literature, we studied performance, we studied drama, theory, and I loved all of it, right? I loved all of it, and I loved the way that it helped me advance to answer a question in ways that I don't think a single discipline can. Truth be told, when it came time to apply PhDs, I was like, I so wanted to go to a PhD in ethnic studies. Professor HoSang, you went to SC, right?
SC, yeah, in ethnic studies and American studies.
Yeah, that's the one. I was like, that was my top choice place I wanted to go because I was like, they're doing it. But I didn't get in. And then also people, this will happen in academia, where a lot of people will dispense advice because they think they know better, as opposed to like see what's best for you and the questions you have. I was given the blanket advice to like go pick a discipline. And I promise you, I really mean it. I arbitrarily picked sociology. I was like, well, I guess I read this one book a lot, Omi and Wynant, Racial Formation in the US, and their sociology. So like, I guess that's what I'll do. Because I was like, maybe I'll do history. My advisor was like, no, you'll hate it. I don't know why he said it. I was like, oh, I'll do English. And then the other one said like, no, you'll hate it. And someone said education. They're like, you can't get in because you have no like real life teaching experience. So I kind of fell into sociology accidentally, and then was like, what the hell is like, what the hell? I thought sociology was about the study of like inequality. And like all people here care about is like publishing in journal articles. Like you could study Mexican communities and have like no relationships with any people who are Mexican. Like I remember I was like, how are you studying Mexican Americans and you don't know anything about Chicano study? Like I was so confused. That's my rant. But back to your actual question. I incorporate a lot of interdisciplinary more now than before. When I was being socialized into social, I was often really scared to. Nowadays, I am a huge fan of the methodology that goes into memoir writing, creative nonfiction, journalism. I think that there's a certain rigor there and accountability to facts that are that exists in ways that are like, we don't fact check in sociology. You can't get away in journalism without fact checking up the wazoo, right? With literature, one thing I've learned is because I'm dealing with writing about colonized people, what does that mean? There's no records for a lot of the things. They're destroyed because of war, right? And so my only tool at hand is sometimes speculative nonfiction. Or I think Carla Conejo, oh my God, the Undocumented Americans author. You know what I'm talking about? Carla Villavicencio. She talks about magical realism. I was just listening to a podcast of hers where she talks about the use of magical realism in her book. That's the way to tell truth sometimes. And we're talking about dissemination. Sometimes I am very grateful to the people that read my book and produce like documentaries or like Instagram posts. Like, you know, they're trying to get likes or whatever, but I think they're trying to also like get the word out in ways that are faster than academia can. Min, nowadays my jam right now is personal essay. I teach at a predominantly POC, working class, first generation college student, people that are parents, non-traditional students. Yes, she is at Yale, right? I teach a lot of students who are historically been marginalized by academia. And so for me, the way I've been able to get buy-in from them and to tap into the unique intellectual wisdoms creative wisdoms that they have has been through the personal essay. So I teach an immigration class right now, and their text is personal essays from the site, the journal Catapult. So catapult.co. You have writers like Nicole Chung, Brian Washington, the Matt Ortile. These are folks that their training is such that they write about provocative, important topics in a way that gets people to read them, right? And I think academia has that issue of like, we write really great stuff, but it's for like 3 people to read. And so I've really learned a lot from my journalism friends and my public writer friends to harness certain skills that they have to get the word out a lot quicker. So that's a longer convo though. So please email me if you want to chat. Are you a grad student?
Yes, I am.
Okay, so
I'm in American Studies. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. I was like, I think you're a grad student. So yeah, hit me up anytime.
Yeah,
And this applies
thank
for
you so
anyone in the
much.
room. So
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thanks for that question, Min. And it's like such a great, like what you're describing about how like in a discipline, you have to like understand the conventions, but that doesn't mean that's the only work you can do, right? And you're exceeding them in so many ways, which is such a great model. I think we're gonna go to the room now, and Kaylee has a question.
Hi, I can't see myself. This is so, I hope I'm not like horribly close to the computer.
We got
But hello. Oh, there I am. Hi, Dr. Ocampo and Professor HoSang. Thank you so much for this talk. I just wanted to, I apologize if this is already explained in the book, but I was just wondering if you could briefly run us through like your method of getting these, like is like 85 people that you worked with? Like, was it like people that, are you allowed to do this? Maybe this is like research on 101, but like, was it people that you had known naturally from like the community? And my kind of second question on this is that if everyone, as I understand, was like from the LA area, what do you think about like their like maybe racial formation and their understanding of the identity based on that particular geography? Because personally, I grew up in like Orlando, Florida. And so I remember when I was first even starting to like having the similar sentiment, like, dang, like nobody talks about us. Like, where are we? And then even after that, I was like, dang, everyone's in California. Like maybe I have to go there. And like, still thinking that there's still this gap in like other geographical areas around the US and understanding Filipino and Filipino American identity. But yeah, I don't know, with those two questions, those are two questions. Okay.
yeah. First off, let me just say that I would absolutely love to read an essay or a piece about what it means to be a Filipino person in Orlando, Florida, or what it means to be a Filipino at Yale University. I would read the hell out of that piece, because I think that there's so much to learn from that like I grew up in LA, so it's kind of different. And I think that there's something about to the earlier thing we mentioned about like what it means to be a Filipino person in Orlando or the South, or the Midwest. I always said I wanted to write a book about Filipinos in the hopes that people would read it and be like, nah, he got that stuff wrong. It's not like that where I'm from. And then they'd be inspired to like write their own book, right? So that's my shameless plug to like say, I want to hear your stories. Please write them so I can like read them. To answer your question about methods, in sociology, we're not permitted to like formally interview anyone that is already in our network that we know intimately. So someone that I would grab dinner with, for example. And I know that in other writing genres, you can do that, right? In memoir, for example, it is imperative to like have a rigorous relationship and interview people in your life. And I find that to be quite daunting of a task. As someone that's tried interviewing my mom or dad for memoir purposes, it is a method that I think it's harder in some ways than talking to strangers because they know you. Anyway, so in sociology, we kind of have to keep a like arm's length approach. And so I tended to meet folks that were like friends of friends. that I could interview. Back in the day, this is when Facebook was a little bit more prominent. I would set up like Facebook pages of like Filipinos in Eagle Rock, Filipinos in Carson, and then they sort of self-populated because Filipinos are like, yeah, Carson, yeah, and like, and originally what I wanted to do was show how different racial neighborhood context shapes sense of identity. So that was the research design, and of course things change over time, but every time I give a talk and it's in a different place, I am always so like intrigued that there are some things that folks find are similar. So I remember I interviewed someone that went to like Cornell, and now Cornell has like a Mecha and the Filipino Club are like sibling organizations there, right? I thought that was really intriguing because of the context of Ithaca was such that it drove them together. But you know, who's to say that would happen at Hunter College in New York City? I don't know. And that's where I feel like I'm like starving to have more Filipino American qualitative researchers, because there's just so much cool work to be done, that there's a lifetime of, like, you could do 5 million studies right now. It's just you need to have the people that get it to do it.
Great. Thanks. Okay, so I think we have two more. We have one from the room and one from Zoom. So I'm going to invite Bella, who's has a question from the South. Hey, Bella.
Hi. Yeah, I just had a question about framework and the applicability of the book's framework. So is this idea of Latinos in Asia applicable outside a US context? And if so, can it help us better understand things like labor migration, especially domestic labor in East Asia? So kind of general framework applicability question.
You know, that's a really great question. And I think, like, for those that are a little bit familiar with the global position of Filipinos, there's this perspective that Filipinos are like the go-to laborers of the world. Like, Philippines as like what Robin Rodriguez calls the labor brokerage state. Our biggest export is human labor. About 10% of the citizenry lives abroad and then like sends money back home. So they live all over the place: Japan, Singapore, the Middle East, like the UAE, Canada, oddly enough, not South America for some reason, but in a lot of Western and Middle Eastern countries and East Asia. So I think that there's a comparable experience between the Filipinos that migrate as like domestic workers or these type of jobs, and say like pockets of Latin American migrants that go to Spain. Like, there's my friend Christina Mora does a lot of stuff on South American migrants that go to Spain and how they develop like Latinx pan-ethnicity, but in Spain instead of like the United States. And I thought that was really interesting. I've only had the privilege to be in Barcelona once in my life for like 2 days. And I remember encountering some Filipinos there. And in my head, I was like, just wondering, like, what would it be like to be a Filipino kid growing up in Spain, in the colonizer's land, right? Because you would have all the like ability to speak Spanish. You might have the last name. You'd have the Catholic going. I wonder if it would be easier for a Filipino kid to come of age in a country like Spain than, say, like a Chinese or Korean kid. And thinking about that question helps me wonder about your question of like, is this connection between Filipinos and Spanish/Latinx culture going to emerge in other contexts? It's a good question. It's a good question, and it's a big I don't know.
Thanks for that great question, and yeah, really thoughtful answer. Okay, we have one. We're close to time. This has been such a rich discussion. I'm going to turn to Enya for one more question on Zoom, and then we'll go right into our closing.
Dr. Ocampo, thank you so much for this talk. This was just really eye-opening. And I have a question selfishly about like, what would your advice be for people who want to study like Asian Americans? Because I'm in the psych department here. And one thing I struggle to like juggle is both the idea that like Asian American as an identity was created for solidaristic purposes, but it's also a category that is, you know, that erases a lot of disparities. And so for someone who studies like the cross-racial solidarity of Asian Americans, what would your advice be for, you know, how to move forward? Like, is disaggregation the way to go? Or like, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think we need your work. One thing that I was actually a psych major first, and I wanted to study Asian American psychology, social psychology. And I just didn't feel like people cared. And so I just like quit. And so I'm so glad that you're there doing this work, because it's gonna matter so much. There's just, I think in psych, from the read I get from the way Asian Americanness is approached in psych, I've seen one of two things happen. I've seen, like, I think a lot about the work of Margaret Shi, who's a social psychologist, and the amazing work that she's done on the way that Asian women, if they're primed about race versus gender, what that does to like academic outcomes. I think of her as someone that does like really creative work, merging like Asian Americanness and like social psych methods. And then I think of folks like EJ David and Kevin Nadal, who are like disaggregating Filipinos from Asian Americans and seeing the utility that can happen there. I guess I feel like I just want to like grab coffee with you and just be like, yo, what are your instincts about what's happening in psychology? Because I feel like you have a bazillion of them inside of you, and we could have like a 5-hour convo about them. But I guess the bottom line is that in the world of sociology, what I wanted to study, I wanted to study what I studied, and I wanted to write about what I wanted to write about. And it was very, very hard. It was very hard because 99% of people didn't get it. And for a long time, seeing people's blank faces really, really hurt my confidence and my feelings. But I'm kind of stubborn. And I was like, no, I really feel like there's something to this. And I also got a lot of energy from folks in the community, broadly speaking, that said, hey, this instinct you have is there's something there, just keep at it. And then I finally got to the point where I wrote a book, and now that book is serving the purpose of legitimizing Filipinos that have like bigger questions than mine. And I feel really happy that my book has played that role. And so I say this in the sense that I think in the world of psychology, I am very aware that studying Asian Americans in psych is a challenge. It's like saying like I want to study Asian Ams in econ, right? I know the hill that you're up against, and I would just encourage you to do two things: like really, really believe this, like have like an irrational amount of self-belief, because you're onto something pretty darn amazing. And don't let any dickhead, and I'm just like so angry because I know what you're going through, and it reminds me of like how hard is it to like pursue a topic. So keep at it, but more productively. I think that there's amazing social scientists who are Asian American in political science. I think about my friend Janelle Wong, Karthik Ramakrishnan. There's poli-sci is not a place that's friendly to Asian American studies. And so what I sometimes find solace in is identifying the folks who seem to be doing the damn thing in places that they're not supposed to, right? Back to Carla Cornejo Villavicencio, she talks about how she has an obsession with animals that grow up in inhospitable environments, and she finds inspiration in that. And so it really resonated with me when I heard that, because I found that I was really drawn to scholars that exist in really inhospitable environments. I love reading about W.E.B. Du Bois. I love reading about Ron Takaki. I love reading about the people that like broke down walls because their stories are what get me through the hard days. So that's like, I don't even know if I'm answering your question, but like, I'll say this. Hit me up. Let's have a convo. Let's have a further chat about this, because I'm actually really like intrigued about the work you're doing. So same for the grad students in the room. Like, please, I'm happy to be an extra unofficial committee member to help cheer you on your journeys.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for the question. I'm going to turn it back over to the room. I want to just thank you, Professor Ocampo, and your response there it's another whole part of your academic profile of mentorship, community formation, thinking about intellectual and political work is always happening through connections, not just the isolated individual. So I'm so grateful for that work. Thank you, and I'll turn it back over.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professors HoSang and Dr. Ocampo. If we could get a virtual round of applause in the chat, or La Casa Cultural downstairs, like put those hands up. You two have been, there's the applause. Thank you so much. It has been such a fruitful and amazing conversation. And I know that not just the Filipino Club, but I feel like everyone here who came out, I've learned so much about racial constructions and what an identity really means. So thank you. We'd also like to thank our co-sponsors, the Center for the Study of Race, Indigeneity, and Transnational Migration, the Council on Southeast Asia Studies, the Program in Ethnicity, Race, and Migration, and the Intercultural Affairs Council. Huge shout out to La Casa Cultural for hosting us and inviting us to their space, especially Rebecca, who helped us set up today. And again, of course, thank you to our speaker, Dr. Ocampo. As a reminder to our guests, please remember to sign in using the link in the chat. We'll be raffling 3 books of Dr. Ocampo's. These books were purchased from People Get Ready bookstore, a local bookstore here in New Haven. So if you need your books, it's a great place to do it. And now I'd just like to invite everyone to turn their cameras on. We'll take a quick group picture if that's okay with people. So feel free to turn your camera on if that's great. Oh, so many lovely faces. Wow, so many people. All right.
All right, ready.
Take it in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right. Again, thank you so much, Dr. Ocampo. If you have any final words or anything you want to say before we all head out.
Thank you. I'm glad that Filipino American History Month isn't just October, it's every month. And for all the folks in here, like, take up as much space as possible. That is the one lesson that I've just started to embrace, is be unapologetic about taking up space, particularly in like super white cis spaces, cis straight spaces. So yeah, the world can learn a lot from you. So I hope to see you in real life soon. And yeah, make my way there sometime, and good luck to whatever everyone's doing. Thank you for such an amazing convo. I haven't had one like this in a very long time. So I feel really lucky. Bye.
Thanks everyone. Enjoy your evening.
Thank you so much.